Talkline Network Radio, America's longest-running Jewish broadcast network, the voice of the Jewish community.
Welcome to the podcast. You are now tuned in to this episode of our podcast. Today, we are going to interview some of the greatest and most influential minds in our field. And now, please welcome your host.
You're listening to Talkline with Zev Brenner, America's premier Jewish broadcast on the air since 1981.
And we're back. It's always great to have Dr. Tevi Troy with us. He is a presidential historian. He's a senior fellow at the Bipartisan Policy Center and former senior White House aide, also Jewish liaison in the White House, author of The Power and the Money, The Epic Clashes Between Commanders-in-Chief and Titans of Ministry, which is coming out next month. And he's written a fascinating article called What Happens When Things Go Wrong in the White House? Welcome back to the program. How are you?
Dev, thanks for having me. I always like being on the show.
Enjoy having you on. And my condolences, and our condolences on the loss of your father a few months ago.
Thank you. I appreciate it. He was a great man. He was a person who was a big Zionist, patriotic American. He was a Jabotinskyite, and he spent time in Israel in the 50s and spoke to me only in Hebrew growing up. So I have a lot of gratitude towards him.
Wow. May his memory be a blessing, and we need more people like that today. We live in a crazy times today, right?
Indeed. It's I've never seen anything like it in all my years of not only following politics, but also as a historian, looking back in history. And it's hard to find a 3-week period that it was as eventful and as momentous and as impactful on American history.
Do you miss being involved in politics? You were in the White House. Do you miss it?
I loved my time in the White House. I don't know if I miss it. Maybe it's a younger man's game, but when I was in the White House, I did not see my kids from Sunday night to Friday night when I came home for Shabbat. And if I were not Shomer Shabbat, I wouldn't have seen them even then. So I'm glad to have the opportunity to spend more time with my family. And I also, I've carved out a niche as a writer. I've written 5 books on presidential history. I get to comment and write in the Wall Street Journal. I get to go on your show. So I like being a public intellectual. And while I enjoyed my time in politics, there's different seasons in life, as it says in Ecclesiastes or Kohelet.
Now, you've seen a change in the Republican Party. When you were there with President Bush, it was a different kind of Republican Party. And this convention is really the coronation of President Donald Trump's view and footprints on the party. So it's a completely different party from when you were there.
Yeah, and it's a huge footprint. Donald Trump has been the nominee 3 times of the Republican Party. There's only one other person who is 3-time nominee of the Republican Party, and that's Richard Nixon. And Richard Nixon didn't do it consecutively. So Donald Trump, 3 straight times, he's been the nominee. And you get to put your stamp on a party when you do that. And so some in the liberal media are grumbling about the platform. Trump, it was a Trump-dictated platform. Trump determined what was in the platform. Yeah, you're right. He sure did, because it's his party now, and it's reflective of what he thinks.
You know, I was impressed at the Republican National Convention where you had Shabbos Kestenbaum, yarmulke wearing, talking about anti-Semitism in Harvard. You had parents whose child is hostage by Hamas terrorists get up, and really the mood of the crowd was just deafening. How they applauded both Shabbos Kestenbaum and also the parents of one who was captured by Hamas terrorists. It's just amazing to hear that. I don't think I would hear that at a Democratic National Convention.
Well, I mean, that's for sure that you wouldn't. And if somebody did do that, they'd probably be booed. But you just look about the invocation, praying for the hostages to come home, which I know I do every day in shul, and not just in shul. So, yeah, it's a different Democratic Party today. And I think they're going to have some ugly fights in their convention about Israel and about the Middle East.
You're talking about the Democrats?
Yeah, I think at the Democratic Convention, there's going to be some ugliness about this. The pro-Hamas protesters already said they're going to make a big mess there. There's a great article in the Wall Street Journal today. The mainstream media has basically been ignoring the protests that are happening outside the Republican convention, but it's filled with anti-Israel, anti-American, and anti-Semitic hatred. And people just aren't talking about it.
I think that's good because, they're trying to they're well funded. The real crime is that these groups that I don't call them pro-Palestinian, they're pro-Hamas, and they're funded
Me
by
too.
well-funded sources, Soros and the Ford Foundation, and lots of money, billions of dollars that are behind them, because one day they're fighting against something against the government, the next time they're fighting against Israel, and tomorrow it could be something else. They're always looking for a cause to fight for.
Yeah, and look, sometimes it's U.S. government funding. I mean, we've seen some of these organizations are actually funded by federal dollars, which is a disgrace. And then you look at that guy, the Palestinian so-called journalist, who was harboring hostages for Hamas. He was working for a 501c3 that gets tax-deductible donations from the United States. That ought to be investigated and absolutely stopped as well.
Absolutely, but you have the situation where things have shifted since October 7th. Unfortunately, even BDS has gotten more popular with certain segments because of the way this is manipulated, and that's probably the best word to use. Manipulated by these groups that are anti-Israel and found an opening to hammer Israel with it.
It's absolutely true, and a lot of what they're teaching on the college campuses is poison, and it's anti-American and obviously anti-Israel, and it's very worrisome. I mean, my oldest kid went to one of these elite schools, and I was very proud of him. But he had a rough experience in many ways, and my younger kids are going to Churro and probably to Yeshiva University.
And that's really, they've seen a tremendous influx of students because they do not want to be on a regular campus. And I can understand why. Not everybody wants to be fighting for it. Listen, Shabbos Kestenbaum, who spoke brilliantly at the Republican National Convention, he said on my program, and we put a clip, I believe it's on YouTube, where he said that he took a class prior to October 7th with a professor and the course was entitled Colonial Settlers, or Settler Colonialism, something of that nature. And in order to get an A in that course, he had to write an anti-Israel paper.
Yeah, and look, I admire Shabbos Kestenbaum and the way he's standing up, but does everybody want that for their children? We've talked about universities before on the show, Zev, and the notion that you'd send your kids to these schools that teach you to be anti-America, anti-Israel, anti-you, anti-West, that was bad enough. But now you couple the propaganda you get with the feeling that your kid's not safe on campus, and that's a bridge too far for many parents, including this one.
Absolutely. And I have to tell you, I have a daughter in Barnard who really had stood up, and she's been speaking up at rallies and spoken in Washington and elsewhere on behalf of students, which she probably would not have done had she not been forced to do so because of the situation. But like even she says, it's frightening where you have students who are shouting death to Israel and you're sitting next to them in the classroom. There's something wrong with this picture. Dr. Tevi Troy is our guest. His fascinating new book upcoming is called The Power and the Money, the epic clashes between commander-in-chief and titans of industry. Dr. Troy just wrote a fascinating article dealing with what happens when things go wrong in the White House. Dr. Tevi. Okay. Dr. Tevi will resume contact with him. And this is a fascinating story because things go wrong not just in the Biden White House. Things have gone wrong in other White Houses as well. And that's the subject of Dr. Tevi Troy's fascinating article dealing with it, not just in the current situation where obviously things are going very wrong, where President Joe Biden is being pressured by almost everybody around him, well, the exception of his wife, Jill, the exception of everybody else. That's an inner circle, that he should resign. And there's a good possibility he may just resign because of that situation where loyal Democrats, Senator Schumer, and you have Senator Schiff and others are saying, and Hillary Clinton and others saying, you must go. And I think slowly he's starting to realize that the time is not on his side in the White House. And it would be a very interesting situation where you would have that scenario where he may be forced to leave before the Democratic convention. I know he was planning to stay on, but looks like things may not be going in his direction as far as that's concerned. So that will be something which the pundits will have a lot to say. And of course, we're looking at what happens when things go wrong, not just in this White House. So your article dealing with things go wrong in various White Houses. It's not just the Biden administration that sees it. You've seen that in other White Houses too, where things go wrong almost from day one.
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, that's a good example of the Clinton administration, where things were so going wrong in the early days. Remember, they talked about gays in the military, and they had that problem of Air Force One, where Bill Clinton was getting a $200 haircut while planes were held up at the LAX airport, and they fired the White House travel office. And there's so many problems in the early days of the Clinton White House that the reporters were already calling it a failed administration 10 days into the administration. So that was an example. But my own example was in the Bush White House. This was in the second term when Hurricane Katrina was happening, and we couldn't get anything right. And I had to do a phone call with a bunch of rabbis explaining what we were doing to help the affected people in New Orleans. And the White House operators, who are normally terrific at what they do, they messed up the call, and I was on mute, and the rabbis were able to speak instead of the other way around. And they couldn't hear me, but I could hear them. And what they were saying was, oh my gosh, they can't even get a phone call right. How can they fix New Orleans? And so I really got an earful until the White House operators were able to fix the problem. And I enjoyed telling the rabbis how much I liked listening into what they were saying.
Didn't something so happen with Obama not with the conversation with rabbis, but with getting it right with the healthcare program where the computers kept crashing?
Well, I mean, Obama administration, that's a great example. The website didn't work. So they had this
Right.
healthcare.gov website, and they bragged about it, and they told everybody to go to healthcare.gov. And so everybody went on that day, and it didn't work, and it completely crashed. And you know what? They'd been warned that your IT people are not going to tell you the truth. The IT people always tell you everything's great when it's not, and that you need to take this issue more seriously. And they didn't. And it was a huge, embarrassing mess.
So let me ask you this question. Now, you were there in the White House during the Bush years. The media was quick to pounce, and you write in your article, quick to pounce if, President Clinton did something wrong, or in the Bush administration, something went wrong, Reagan administration. But it seems in the Biden administration, it seemed glaring. All of a sudden, they woke up that President Joe Biden is not fit for the job. One day they woke up, the day before, and he was 100%, and now he's not. It seems like the media has been covering up. So there's been a change in the media not being as aggressive covering stories if they're working with administrations as far as covering up stories.
Yeah, and I would say there's two things going on there. Number one is that you got the sense that they were lying to you, that they were telling you, oh, Biden's fine, but that wasn't the case. But the other thing was they were so adamant that they were attacking people who were suggesting that, wow, Biden looks a little old. And so those same people who were telling you what a bad person you are for pointing out how old he is, the very next day they said, you know what, actually it's a problem. The Washington Post, I think, had the most delicious attempt at a mea culpa, where they said, Biden's aging appears to have accelerated recently. So that was their way of saying, oh, well, he wasn't old 2 months ago, but it's happened a lot recently. And that was the way they tried to get out of this glaring problem that they were telling us he was fine until suddenly they were telling us he wasn't.
No, so obviously they were covering up and they knew it, but it seems like the integrity of journalists has taken a beating from the days when you were in the White House.
Yeah, look, I always knew that journalists were to the left of where I was, and I didn't necessarily trust everything I read in the paper, but I didn't get the sense that they were on a team so much as they were looking to report stories. And in the early days of the Obama years, there were reports that Obama didn't like Politico because Politico would report bad stories from the Bush administration, just like they reported bad stories from the Obama administration. And the Democrats want to get that kind of, they don't want the fair shake, they want the extra leg up. But now, it's just glaring how anything a Republican does is evil, and anything a Democrat does is kind of overlooked. And we saw this with sometimes you see this in obituaries, the recent loss of James Inhofe, who was a senator. I actually worked for him as an intern once, and they say climate change opponent denier Jim Inhofe dies. When Ted Kennedy died, they didn't say murderer of Mary Jo Kopechne dies. They said lion of the Senate dies. When Robert Byrd died, they didn't say former Klansman Robert Byrd dies. They said longstanding senator dies. So the way they frame it was really quite glaring.
No, it certainly is. Is there any hope that things are going to get back to normal?
There's always hope. Ronald Reagan said, "I know that for America, there's always a brighter day ahead." So, yeah, I hope so. I don't think that this current media model is sustainable. You can't just live with your partisans. You need to get actual subscribers who want to hear the news, and people are desperate. That's why Barry Weiss's Free Press came out of nowhere and has hundreds of thousands of subscribers because they tell the news straight, and it's so hard to find a place that just tells you the news straight.
Now, your new book, which has come out called The Power and the Money, dealing with the clashes between commanders in chief and titans of industry. Now, the prevailing wisdom is that when you have a Republican administration, and business leaders tend to work more with Republican administrations. Has that changed during the Obama-Biden years?
Well, it's also changed during the Trump years. That you see, Trump was sometimes critical of business, and J.D. Vance is much more frequently critical of business. I say that I wrote the book because we're now in an era when both Democrats and Republicans are critical of corporations, and it's a real sea change from where we've been in the past. But you are right to say that a lot of the Democrats have been cozy, I guess, with big business. A lot of CEOs are Democrats, and a lot of these companies are having these new policies, the HR policies that are seen or woke or whatever. And I think that in part is an effort to get the corporations a little relief from the federal government, but it doesn't necessarily work. It's not like Elizabeth Warren is going to lessen her criticism of a big corporation because the CEO is a Democrat.
No, because the conventional wisdom would be, Dr. Tevi Troy, would be that Republicans are more for pro-big business, so business would be more supportive of them. But you find in the last number of years, especially even the Hollywood titans, well, they've always been more left-wing and more involved with Democrats, but even some bigger companies have been very supportive and giving a lot of money. Now you're seeing things starting to shift to Donald Trump, where people who were skeptical of him or were not happy with him all of a sudden are giving money. Even Elon Musk, I think, is giving $45 million a month. This is some new developments. Well, Musk was always more, I guess, in the Republican side, but you find a lot of the titans of industry, I think, have been going more Democratic in the last 7-8 years.
Yeah, I think there's a lot in my book, The Power and the Money, on this subject. You said Hollywood has always been liberal. It actually hasn't. It was only really in the 60s that Lew Wasserman, who was the head of MCA and then the head of Universal, he brought Democrats to Hollywood and made this kind of a Hollywood pipeline to Democratic funding. You mentioned Elon Musk. Yeah, now he leans more Republican, but in his early days, he was made by Democrats. Obama went to visit SpaceX and helped establish SpaceX as a well-known company. Obama had a lot of green incentives for these electric cars, and that's what helped make Tesla this multi-billion-dollar colossus that it is today.
Now, I think there's some Jewish angles in your book, The Power and the Money, right?
Oh, absolutely. Lew Wasserman, who I mentioned a moment ago, was Jewish, and there's a great story in the book that he is trying to do a fundraiser for Lyndon Johnson. But the fundraiser is going to take place at the Coconut Grove, and the Coconut Grove is reserved for that evening. So Wasserman wants to say who's reserving the Coconut Grove that evening, which is a famous hotel in LA, and he finds out that it's reserved for a bar mitzvah. So he calls the father of the bar mitzvah and he says, "Look, I need this room for the president of the United States." The guy thinks about it. He says, "Well, if my son and I can meet the president, then it's okay. Then I'll let you have it." And so the guy hangs up, Wasserman. They made this deal, and Wasserman hangs up. But then the phone rings a couple of minutes later, and the guy says, "The rabbi would also have to meet the president."
And did that happen?
Clearly, yeah. And that's how they made the fundraiser happen.
Wow. So the big bar mitzvahs were in vogue then. I'm not sure if they're still in vogue as much today. People seem to be less involved with religion, at least Judaism in the central outside the Orthodox Jewish community.
Well, I mean, that's a larger problem in the country. I think one of the reasons we've seen the rise of hyper-partisanship, polarization, all this woke stuff is because people are getting away from religion and seeing politics as their substitute for religion. And they are engaging in political disputes with the same fervor that we once had religious disputes. Remember, in the 18th and 17th centuries in Europe, people would kill each other over doctrinal differences. Thank God we don't do that anymore. But now the intensity over political differences is something that's reaching a whole new level.
Now, in your book, The Power of the Money, you write about the clashes, but we've also seen the collusion between some big tech companies and the administration, especially during the Biden administration. Look at how the social media companies, whether it's Google or Facebook and Instagram and even Twitter, before it was sold, were really in collusion as far as suppressing certain ideas that the government didn't want out there.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the book really could be rewritten as, or the title could be rewritten as The Clashes and the Coziness between these commanders in chief and titans of industry, because there are a lot of times when they're working together. But, you know, clashes is kind of sexier and hopefully sells more books. But yeah, I mean, you are seeing this, what I talk about in the book is the enmeshment of business and big government. And they're often working together, they're colluding, and it's not necessarily in the interest of the American people.
Well, there was a book Charles Hyam wrote a number of years ago, which I remembered interviewing him about, where he spoke about big business and how big business was at odds with the government. For example, you had Ford Motor Company was selling trucks to the Germans. You had United States soldiers fighting German soldiers in Ford Motor Company trucks. Chase Manhattan Bank even froze Jewish assets before the Nazis told him to do so. And he had other examples of big companies that were involved in dealing with the enemy and selling and making money from both sides. So this is not a new story. We had the clashes between government and some of these big corporations. I assume these corporations are much bigger today, so the clashes are probably more intense.
Yeah, and that's exactly why I wrote the book, Zev, because it's not a new story. And so my book, The Power of the Money, goes all the way back to Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan. It talks about Henry Ford and the incident you mentioned where Ford factories were building material for the Nazis. And these interactions between presidents and CEOs goes back 150 years. And in part, if you read the book, if you read The Power of the Money, you'll see in part why we now have the situation where both Democrats and Republicans are skeptical of big business. It turns out they have reason to be so.
What would, in your book, what did you find to be the most interesting situation where clash between the government and big titans of industry?
Well, I love Henry Ford. I don't necessarily love Henry Ford. I love the Henry Ford story.
Sorry, right.
Henry Ford was a bit of an anti-Semite, so I don't love that.
Yeah.
But I say a bit because he may have made repentance later in his life, and apparently after the he stopped. He apologized for his anti-Semitism, and he stopped having the Dearborn Independent be as anti-Semitic. And actually, at the end of World War II, he saw a film of the Nazi atrocities, and he was shaken by it and had a stroke not long after. So it's possible. He also was friends with a number of Jews. So his anti-Semitism was kind of a political anti-Semitism and not a personal animus. It's a very strange story, but it's worth looking at my book, The Power of the Money, to see the complexities of the Henry Ford story. But regardless, he really hated Franklin Roosevelt, and he would criticize Roosevelt all the time. But when World War II starts, he has the largest armaments plant in the U.S. at Willow Run in Michigan, and Roosevelt comes out to visit the plant, and poor Henry Ford is kind of stuck in the back seat, sitting between Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, smushed between the two of them, and looking supremely uncomfortable.
Wow. What's your next book going to be about?
Oh, it's a little premature. Let me get this one out, and then, as you know, I'll be happy to go on the show to discuss.
I always love to have you on. It's always great to have you in there. And are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future or how things are going?
One of my heroes, Irving Kristol, used to say, "I'm short-term pessimistic, long-term optimistic." As Ronald Reagan said, I quoted earlier, that for America, there's always a brighter future ahead, and we're in a tough moment now. But I think we'll get through it, and we'll have a better future ahead of us.
Terrific. Because I know you're now with a bipartisan group. I guess we need to see more of that. But you're a senior fellow of the Bipartisan Policy Center, so that's good that you have it's bipartisan. Because today we have too many partisan groups out there.
Yeah, look, I'm conservative, and I believe in the conservative ideology, and I long have. But I also think you can work with people on the other side of the aisle. There's all kinds of areas where there is alignment, where there's shared interests. We all have to figure out how to deal with China. We all have to figure out how to repel Russia from Ukraine. We all need to figure out how to fix our industrial base. So I think you can do it without necessarily demonizing the other side.
That's the way it should be. But unfortunately, well, maybe after the shooting of President Trump, maybe things will calm down a little bit. Who knows?
Oh yeah, they calmed down for about a day, I noticed.
I guess we'll find out, but we nice to see that. Anyway, I want to thank you for being here with us. Dr. Tevi Troy was a senior advisor in the White House. His new book, which is coming out, is called The Power and the Money. Great title, and dealing with the clash between commanders in chief and titans of industry. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks as always for having me.
That's Dr. Tevi Troy here on the Talkline Network.
Thank you for tuning in to
Talkline with Zev Brenner, America's premier Jewish broadcast, the pulse beat of the Jewish community.
For continuous Jewish programs, TalklineNetwork.com, or our 24-hour-a-day listen line at 641-741-0389. For past shows, you can find us on iTunes, Spotify, Amazon, YouTube, Instagram, and all major podcast platforms, or jewishpodcast.org. Thanks for listening to the TalklineNetwork.com.
Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Anyway, great job as always. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Always